but like
Yeah,
dehumanization seems to
the
be it,
worst.
kind of. Yeah, I know, the worst. Sorry. By the way, sorry we've made a 90 episode long philosophy podcast.
Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Will. Here with me today is Lillian, Gil, and Owen. Hey, y'all.
Hey.
Hello.
What's up, everyone?
Today we'll be discussing the revolutionary anti-colonial text of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. For many of our listeners, this is perhaps a text that needs no introduction. It was Fanon's most well-known writing. Translated into English even before Black Skin, White Masks, we do have an episode on that, go check it out. It served as a theoretical source of inspiration for movements such as the Black Panther Party in the United States. Published in 1961, Wretched offers Fanon's analysis of the emancipatory possibilities and potential pitfalls of the Algerian Revolution. From 1954 to 1962, the Algerian National Liberation Front, or the FLN, waged an anti-colonial struggle for independence from France. Fanon, for his part, was a member of the FLN, writing a number of articles for their newspaper El Mujahid. Many of these articles can be found in the book A Dying Colonialism that contains some of my personal favorite essays on the role of the radio in the Algerian struggle, and there's also another essay on the tensions within the practices of medicine in the colonial situation. Throughout these writings, Fanon traces the dialectical transformation of colonial tools of domination, such as the radio and quote-unquote Western practices of medicine, into tools of liberation. On this score, Wretched is no different. Now, I just used the word I hate, dialectical, but it is one of the two essential concepts of grasping the famous or infamous chapter on violence in Wretched. The other concept is that of situation, on which I will briefly discuss near the end of my remarks. My hesitancy with using the word dialectical is due to the fact that many people use the word to mean these two things are related, or sure seems like there's a process going on here, or you think I was inconsistent in my argument? That's just because you're not thinking dialectically. I call this the Walt Whitman defense, where he writes in Leaves of Grass, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Fun story. I used that once with a philosopher friend of mine, Megan Hiska, a guest on the pod, and she said, you know, people just call that inconsistent. She really ate me up there. The Hegel heads will hate to hear this, but these uses of dialectical are not wholly wrong, but they are woefully insufficient. What they are missing is the idea of a qualitative transformation or leap of a concept. Side note, if you are a new listener and want to hear more about dialectics, you should go check out our What is Dialectics series. Now, what do I mean by leap? In Wretched, Fanon politically and psychologically reconstructs the process of violence between the French colonizers and the FLN. For those unfamiliar with the Algerian Revolution, you should know that violence is not a metaphor here. The French beat, tortured, experimented on, and violated Algerian women and men in myriad ways. I won't repeat the visceral examples Fanon offers in this introduction, but suffice it to say that the French did not fight a quote-unquote clean war. They did not even acknowledge that it had been a war until 1999, and Macron only offered a sort of apology in 2021. The movement of the chapter is one of internalization and externalization. The Algerians internalized the degradation and aggression from the French colonial forces. It wreaks havoc on their psyche and their social bonds by inculcating feelings of rage, shame, and apathy. However, this state of internalization cannot last forever. The violence boils over and is externalized back into the world and back onto others. Fanon does not offer a romantic account of this process, as he notes that this externalization of aggression is first against other Algerians, or is sublimated through dance and other social practices. Insofar as the externalization remains in this place, being externalized against one's fellows or only through sort of cultural practices, he thinks there is no leap or change in the quality of the violence. It is only when the externalization of violence takes the form, and that's an important word, I think, for Fanon, the form of decolonization, i.e., the proper object of the source of violence, French colonizers, is overtaken by the self-activity of Algerians as subjects. In other words, the externalized violence takes a political form. To be rather technical, Fanon is reconstructing the transformation of those who had been objects of violence into subjects, and those who had taken themselves as the subjects of history and progress, becoming the properly apprehended object of constraint, limitation, and domination. This reversal of subject-object is the core, or to use Marx's language in capital, I would say the cell form of the chapter on violence. Without an appreciation for the subject-object relation, the chapter becomes either mere sociological description or the arbitrary endorsement of violence. However, from what I have said, you would be right to ask, where is the dialectical leap? Is this not a reinstantiation of the dreaded cycle of violence, a phrase people in the West love to use when talking about almost anywhere else in the world? Is Fanon not simply endorsing revenge? That the colonized have the right to make themselves moral monsters like the French? A merely external reading of Fanon could lead people to these conclusions. After all, violence is violence, no matter who makes use of it. One could try to help Fanon by claiming that his position is that counter-violence is justified, but the cost would be making Fanon out to be a rather anodyne contemporary political philosopher who is only interested in judging whether an act is justified or not. No shame, but I think there's more going on than him just being an analytical political philosopher. More seriously, it does not escape the problem that Fanon set out all the way back in Black Skin, White Masks. It does not get the colonized beyond being merely reactive rather than actional, and thus, ironically, does not break the cycle of violence. The qualitative leap that can only be comprehended dialectically is the understanding that the form of violence that the Algerians employ has its concept, its germ, the principle of self-emancipation. Comparatively, the form of violence the French employ has as its concept domination and submission. It is only from the elaboration of self-emancipation that qualitatively new society can be developed by the Algerians. So while the violence between the French and the Algerians may look the same from the outside, as it were, in reality, the quality of the violence has been fundamentally altered. With this said, allow me to quote Fanon. Quote, "Decolonization is an historical process." There's the process talk. In other words, it can only be understood, it can only find its significance and become self-coherent insofar as we can discern the history-making movement which gives it form and substance. But how do we make this discernment? Fanon goes on to say, decolonization is the encounter between two congenitally antagonistic forces. So there's a relationship between two things in contradiction. It focuses on and fundamentally alters being. It infuses a new rhythm specific to a new generation of men with a new language and a new humanity. And that is the qualitative leap I've been talking about. But all of this can only be discerned insofar as we integrate our analyses into the colonial situation. There's the second concept of situation. You can understand this as the historical context through which decolonial violence emerges. For Fanon, the situation precedes the actors, and thus we must grasp the character and form of the situation if we are to understand the truth of decolonization and violence. Without the concept of situation, we will not be able to make sense of the internalization-externalization process between subject and object. Furthermore, it is only with the abolition of the colonial situation that the leap of freedom can be actualized. However, earlier I said, Fanon politically and psychologically reconstructs the process of violence, but you may have noticed I have really only focused on the political reconstruction, or the externalization half of the internalization-externalization dyad. No doubt this is what Fanon is most known for, but we should not forget that Fanon was a trained and practicing psychiatrist. He saw firsthand what violence does to the subjectivity not only of the victims, but those who employ violence, both colonizer and colonized. There's a tendency to read the first chapter on violence as Fanon's final word before he moves on to discussions of nationalism and spontaneity. But the last main chapter of the book is a collection of his case files for Algerian and French patients during the war. And yes, before Fanon resigned his position at a French psychiatric hospital, he treated French colonizers who were traumatized by their own torture of Algerians. It's crazy. Indeed, in one particular case of a French torturer who terrorizes his wife and children at home, Fanon notes that, quote, he asked me in plain language to help him torture Algerian patriots without having a guilty conscience, without having any behavioral problems, and with total peace of mind, end quote. This last chapter, titled Colonial War and Mental Disorders, strikes a rather dour note to end the text on the promise of revolution. He writes at the beginning, quote, but the war goes on, and for many years to come, we shall be bandaging the countless and sometimes indelible wounds inflicted on our people by the colonialist onslaught, end quote. He goes on to say, perhaps the reader will find these notes on psychiatry out of place or untimely in a book like this. There's absolutely nothing we can do about that. We had no control over the fact that the psychiatric phenomenon, the mental and behavioral disorders emerging from this war, have loomed so large among the perpetrators of pacification and the pacified population, end quote. A truly dialectical comprehension of Fanon's concept of decolonization must integrate this double helix of political externalization and psychological internalization and bring out their tensions and contradictions. I will conclude with an example. Fanon describes treating a patient who participated in a successful struggle for independence in another African country. Fanon, of course, does not say which. They did so by placing a bomb that killed 10 people. The patient suffers anxiety and suicidal ideation on the anniversary of the explosion because he has no way of knowing if he did not kill some innocent passersby. Fanon notes, quote, this militant who never for a moment had a thought of recanting fully realized the price he had to pay in his person for national independence. Such borderline cases pose the question of responsibility in the context of revolution, end quote. Lest we think that either victory or the justice of a cause automatically reconstructs the psychology of the subject, Fanon writes in a footnote about this patient, quote, in other words, our actions never cease to haunt us. The way they are ordered, organized, and reasoned can be a posteriori radically transformed. It is by no means the least of the traps history and its main determinations set for us. But can we escape vertigo? Who dares claim that vertigo does not prey on every life? End quote. Why even include this? Where are the quote unquote new men of the first chapter? I think it is a shame that people rarely discuss these lines because without them, we lack the comprehension of the double helix between politics and psychology that animated much of Fanon's theory and practice. I sense that the tendency to screen this chapter out of discussion of Fanon and violence is that it lacks the heroism and transformative verve of the first chapter. Indeed, it might seem as if the chapter negates the argument of the first. Nothing could be further from the truth. Instead, the lesson is that Fanon saw violence soberly, without the unreflective excitement that some, even those who agree with him, have attributed to him. He saw the psychological shattering of violence and still could grasp its necessity. Our task, I think, is to grasp why. It is only through this dialectical structure of the double helix between politics and psychology in situations of violence that Fanon continues to have something to say to us. It is through this double helix that we can elaborate Fanon's unfinished concept of freedom. So I apologize for the long introduction, but I wanted to set up the readings that we did and the stakes of it and all of that. But with that, I will conclude and I will hand it off to you all. What did you all think of the reading?
Yeah, I'll start. That was a really wonderful introduction. Thanks, Will. I am really happy. I was saying this to you before we hit record. I'm really happy that you had us look at the mental disorder chapter from the end of the book. I think you've got to be right about like why it is that this sort of falls out of the discussion because the tone is very different, right? You know, I think that if you only read chapter one of Wretched, and I've been guilty of this for a long time, right? Like, it's the way that it gets taught most often, for instance, and it's understandable why, right? Like you said, there's like a transformative verve to it, and it also does contain like the most convincing argument in favor of the necessity of violence, especially for emancipatory and liberatory struggle, that you're likely to find anywhere, as far as I'm concerned. But you can also, if that's all you look at, walk away with a very sort of one-sided, to insist with you that this is a dialectical thinker, a very one-sided understanding of what it is that Fanon is up to and what he actually takes to be true here, where it seems as though you get all these lines, right? Like the emancipatory violence is this transformative act in which like everything changes, and like one becomes part of this movement of a new humanity in throwing off the shackles of the oppressor in this compartmentalized world in which there is nothing but dehumanization. Right? That all sounds dope. That shit sounds tight. Sick. Fuck. I love that stuff.
I love the death of dehumanization.
We
Let me
fucking
be
love to see the death of
on record,
dehumanization. I love
okay?
the birth of the new human being. Let's go. And then you get to the last chapter and he's like, all right, and then like what are we going to do with these kids? They're 13 years old. They just live in this context where like they killed one of their classmates, and he's like, why? And they're like, what do you mean? And it's devastating.
Yeah.
It's devastating. And so like he's very, you said sober, that's the right word for it, right? It's not uncritical celebratory. It's not like just like laudatory that this is like it's going to be fun and cool. It's like, no, this is a tragic necessity that he's struggling to articulate. And I just think that's really important. So I was really grateful for it.
Yeah, it's really jarring to read, like not the like the middle sections, but to read those two, the front and the end together, because the language that Fanon uses when he talks about violence in that first chapter, he connects it to like forces of enlightenment, that there's a therapeutic element to it, that it restores like dignity, that there's a kind of not just the material necessity of trying to undo the colonial situation violently, but there's also a kind of psychic necessity to restoring one's sense of self, one's dignity, one's standing. So it has not only that material necessity, it also has a kind of psychic necessity in order to become free. And yet that thing which is psychically necessary is also psychically destructive. And so one gets this sense that trying to figure it out, that it's hard to understand a way out that doesn't involve like deep psychic harm, because not doing anything, remaining subjugated, remaining pacified, as he puts it, right? Remaining pacified absolutely distorts and mutilates like one's subjectivity. And yet, like the attempts to violently get out will also leave like incredible scars, distortions, symptoms. And so I really appreciated in your intro the way that you framed like the tension between these two. And I honestly don't know exactly how Fanon sees. I don't think there's a resolution to it, but how he weighs these two considerations.
Yeah, in response to what Owen was saying, I mean, the reason why I want you all to read the concluding chapter is not because, at the end of the day, I want to say, see, to take some sort of moralistic stand of, see, violence is bad. So the, people who are colonized, and let's not beat around the bush, those who are colonized today in, Israel's heinous war, we can call it that, against Gaza. Fanon didn't draw the conclusion of, so people should just take it. They should just avoid it. But I think what is important is that there is a deeper principle at play in the deployment of violence than it simply being violence as such. He is hoping that the violence articulates what I call the sort of a principle of self-emancipation. But what you're saying, Owen, the thing is, I don't want to do the whole thing of saying, well, partially it is, Fanon raced to finish this book because he knew he was dying from cancer. And so one might look at it as, it seems like the book might not be as finished as it could be. I think it's too easy. I think, and I'll see what you all think about it. I think Fanon's searching for the mediation that will allow psychic and political emancipation to mutually reinforce one another. And I think one of his answers was the work of creating the nation. That it would be in that collaborative, cooperative work that at a sufficient, let's say, a sufficient level of scale, that those who participated in the anti-colonial effort will be able to process their experience and normatively arrange it such that it no longer is like almost a stick in the machine of their working. whether we find that answer convincing or not, I think that's the answer he's looking for. So it's important to try to maybe say that he tries to offer an answer so that, listeners don't think that, oh, so it turns out Fanon actually thinks violence is never necessary and we just all need to find a good therapist. That's not where he ends up. But I thought it was important to show that the movement forward politically doesn't necessarily mean that, there will be the same type of movement forward psychologically, he thinks.
I want to ask about the dynamic of, I forget how you put it, Will, repression and then externalization. Is that what it was?
Internalization, externalization.
Yeah.
Internalization and externalization of violence. Do you think that this is a classically psychoanalytic view of psychic power, or do you feel like he's up to something else? Is this a repression, reality principle issue, kind of problem? I know it's not the same, but is that a similar dynamic that he's talking about, or is it a shift away from that in some important way?
I think it's similar insofar as there could be, I guess, a few years ago, all of his psychiatric writings were collected in a single volume. It's massive stuff. And, I think the work is just now being done of who Fanon was actually reading in psychiatry and all of that. Yes, he had read some Freud, but, even in Black and White Mask, you see him becoming disenchanted with Freudism. He thinks it's too ahistorical. He has this joke in Black and White Mask where he's like, yeah, the rifle in the dream of the colonized, it doesn't represent the penis. No, it represents the rifle that's been pointed at him in his actual life. So one way of saying is he buys the idea that our organism responds to our environment. And he's working with a theory that, any sort of psychic pain will have some sort of also physical symptom. But I think that's as far as it goes. And now he's trying to move away from a sort of trans-historical architecture, moving more towards a concrete historical explanation of how we become actional beings, how we interact. And he actually, if you read the violence chapter, he constantly comes back to the word work, how we work on the world. And for him, I think it means how we externalize, but also bring the world back into us.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked is because, so this was also my intuition that if there's kind of a Freudian background here at all, which I wasn't sure, that there does seem to be a criticism of that ahistorical nature, the kinds of things I would say about psychoanalysis, I think he might likewise be saying, but part of what he's searching for, I was wondering if it was right to put it this way, is what would create a shift in the reality principle? What would make it change shape? Because that's a concept that Freud uses that feminists and various other social philosophers will criticize for having a structure that is a social, and I think it's not, I think people either kind of back away from psychoanalysis or don't when they get stuck on how to shift the social content of that around. So that's what I was thinking of when you were talking about the link between the psychological and the political.
I think the reality principle for him is the situation. Again, I want to make it clear, even when he's doing the case files, he says explicitly, all of these disorders, we assume that, they are drawn from the situation first, and then they appear in the individual. And so to use the kind of language you're using, the reality principle, the situation represents a type of a horizon of activity, and it can appear as if it's unsurpassable. But he wants to show that no, that reality principle is not reality as such. That's why he uses this kind of florid metaphor of decolonization, almost creating a new reality. I'd like to hear what you all think about it. I never quite know what to do with him saying it's like a tabula rasa. It wipes the slate clean. And it seems like for him, he means it's uprooting the reality principle or the situation. It makes possible a type of invention or creativity that could not happen under current conditions. But the reason why I don't know what to make of it is, but then you get to these case files and it's where is the tabula rasa? So Yeah, I don't have a
Yeah.
fully fledged answer, honestly.
I mean, it's a very sort of, I understand it as a very Marxian sort of thing, right? It's that line, right? Men create history, but under conditions not of their own choosing. Like situations away, and this is someone on Twitter when we posted we were going to make a Fanon episode. I won't name them, but mention like, oh, I hope you talk about the critique of dialectical reason. Like, there's a lot here. It's a Sartrean concept situation in a lot of ways. And also that dynamic of internalization, externalization is something that he's trying to work out in the CDR. You know, we have praxis and counter-praxis and finality and all this sort of stuff, and our ways of thinking about how one is able to sort of exercise a minimal degree of agency or autonomy, but only within circumscribed limits that themselves turn out to be mutable and variable. It's not as though the situation is given once and for all, but also that, you know, what Fanon is specifically interested in is the sort of political exigency and psychopathological consequences of this precise kind of situation, called that of colonization, in which I'd be curious to hear what you all think. I think that the overriding principle, what distinguishes this from anything else, is the fact of dehumanization. You know, there's more we could say
Yeah.
perhaps about, like, you know, what distinguishes this or that colonial situation. And, you know, whenever you offer a definition, the first thing we philosophers do is come up with a counterexample. We're annoying. But like
Yeah,
dehumanization seems to
the
be it,
worst.
kind of. Yeah, I know, the worst. Sorry. By the way, sorry we've made a 90 episode long philosophy podcast. Anyway, but yeah, I don't know, the fact of dehumanization, like I don't think there is tabula rasa in the sense of like the situation is effaced entirely, but something about what becomes possible in and through anti-colonial decolonial struggle is something like opening a crack of a window onto a world where dehumanization isn't just given as a fact, something like that. I don't know if that's sufficient.
It's history.
Yeah.
History is
Yeah.
there's prehistory and history. I think that's the Marxian stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he employs that language.
The prehistory of humanity is literally like how Marx talks about that. No, and then history the beginning of the real history of humanity might in fact be the top. I mean, I was wondering if the only way you get a clean conceptual break like that is if you think about prehistory and history, because what's starting now? Like what would you be?
Yeah, I think that's right, because the language that he uses at the end of the violence chapter, where he talks about the fate of the third world and moving forward, like how decolonization and like liberated society should proceed, he's very much like he's puts a really strong emphasis on like this is when the new human can be created. And obviously like the violent part of decolonization is a necessary element of that. But he says like between even like, amongst the Europeans, and he has this appeal to the European proletariat too, to saying like this is the chance to create a new human and a new humanity. It's like deeply universalist at that moment, right? He's you know, so that I think that's a good reading of what that tabula rasa means. It doesn't show up the day after the colonizer is kicked out. It's like it might be under the banner of a new international, like of a new international or new internationalism. A new human is possible. Europe will have to play its part, and so obviously will formally colonize peoples. But I think I like that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I also like that reading with you, the end of prehistory and the beginning of history, because he keeps coming back to that. So, you know, for those who haven't read it, you know, one of the thematics he keeps coming back to is that colonialism is a type of petrification. There's a French word, substantialization, is translated as reification. I don't know if that's the French translation of Lukács or something like that. But anyway, this idea that, you know, for so long the colonized have been regarded as if they were not a part of the historical creation of human freedom. And so it's important to know that, you know, part of the fire of violence is that the colonized seeing themselves as a part of history again, feeling themselves as being active again. He loves using stuff like, you know, being on the move. He uses the, you know, now I don't think that they're really just metaphors about the sort of working out of the muscles and all of that. I think he's probably also literal there. And he's thinking that this feeling of movement and creation, that even the proletarian Europe, they want that as well. They want to no longer be cramped in their regimes of exploitation, etc. But he's saying this is where history is moving to. And so it's a type of appeal. And I like that you end on that note of universalism, because I think sometimes people think Fanon isn't a universalist. And I don't know, I hate to tell you, you might not hate that he read Marx and he was actually really favorable to Marxism, but he never gave it up. And he thinks that it could only work with a type of universalism, which isn't the same as saying don't acknowledge any differences.
No, of course. I think about those lines all the time. I'm glad that you pointed that out. The sort of being frozen in place, petrification, rigidification. Like, again, I read him as very much like in dialogue with this existentialist tradition for whom freedom is understood not as a static property, but a movement, right? A movement of transcendence, precisely. And this is why I think it's so closely tied to the critique of dehumanization. Is there anything less human than being put, quote, in your place? And being prevented from being able to move. That's, the compartmentalized world. It's this like, that's where you're supposed to be and don't fucking move, right?
And we've got guns on the borders to make sure you don't
100%. You have your place, right? And that's inhuman. That's inhuman. And then the lines then about like, muscular tonality and like the dream of movement, the dream of not being confined. It's very literal. I don't take that to be metaphorical at all. It's a dream of freedom. And how could that not be universalist? I don't understand the non-universal reading. I don't get it.
I'm trying to be better and not dunk too much. So I will leave it there. I will say it's not convincing the non-universalist reading.
To go back to that scary word, I mean, I think part of the problem for a lot of readers of Fanon is that there are clear moments where he emphasizes the specificity of race and nation and the role that specificity can play in liberation. Yeah. But you just have to not understand that he's a dialectical thinker to like assume that means then that he's not a universalist and
it's a stage. And it's an international. It's a concrete step.
Yeah.
He doesn't think that we can just say, okay, we're all universally humans. I mean, what happens in the second third of violence chapter is violence in the international context. And we could talk a little bit more about this. He starts talking, at least as well as he is able, starts talking about economics. He's like, no, land is essential. Mm-hmm. Of course. He almost sounds, someone will eventually read in the podcast, he almost sounds like Emile Cabral. He's talking about we need to understand the soil and and reinvigorating it and growing what we need. And so again, violence for him isn't metaphorical. It isn't also some weird sort of enthusiasm of getting revenge. He's talking about what creates these conditions for a stable, flourishing social life. And these are going to be questions that need to be answered.
I actually would like to pursue that line of thought a bit further, because I think that there are, for good reason. So basically, when it comes to nationalist politics, I think that a pretty broad scope of left-wing positions is skeptical of nationalist politics to a point. And I share this. So I'm not saying this about other people. I share this. So if I think nationalist politics is strategically necessary, it is only as strategically necessary. Not because I think that the left should develop an uncritical or even comfortable alignment with nationalist politics. This is my view. I think that the reason for that discomfort is the claims that people tend to make about the land and self-determination and who is properly there and what the harm being done is. I think in the immediacy of the situation, the colonial situation, make a great deal of sense and then are very difficult to generalize about. And I think that this is just the basic problem and point of contestation, because there is an obvious way in which all of those kinds of claims can go sideways and become reactionary very quickly when they are not specifically about the thing that you are discussing, the colonial environs. I think that also all claims to the land are not necessarily nationalist. I think that's usually too quick. That's not the automatic. I think in the post-colonial, anti-colonial sliding into independence, there were nationalist movements and there was an ideology and a set of arguments about self-determination that were tied to nationalist projects. And those recur, like those are not irrelevant now, but they're just not, like claims about the land and self-determination are actually not reducible. But where, those boundaries are is not clear, and that's where the anxiety is. So I'd like to know, like, what is it about the land that creates this kind of harm and psychic harm? And I think this should be a materialist point, but also the land is like the most fundamental and basic thing that I often feel like maybe, is it too obvious? Is it too obvious the harm is being done? Is it just like it's so clear what this harm is that the rights to the land are obvious? Or is there something that people that we don't think about enough?
Yeah. I don't know exactly how to answer it, but I just do think as a bit of context, it's hard for me for my mind not to immediately go to thinking about some of the claims that Zionists make about Palestine, which is that Zionists will often say, there's so many places, Arab countries around here. Like, why do you care so much about staying here? Like, just go. Like, what is it about this land? Like, they speak your language and have your religion in Jordan and in Egypt and in, what is it? It's something that I have been trying to think through, but I don't think I have. I mean, there are some obvious answers, which is like, it's fucking not yours. But like, I don't have I've been trying to think in a bit more complicated way about it. Yeah.
I think I'll just try to see what, maybe, Fanon would think about this. I think at a very high level of abstraction, the land, we can talk about the land as being a place of crops, but also the land is where attachments to home are. But I think what he's thinking, if we're staying with this, the word of the dialectical, is like, it is through the land that I work and find out who I am with other people. And so to lack access to the land is to lack the ability to externalize myself. I know that this sounds like a kind of Hegelian account, but for Fanon, it's very important that whatever freedom is, it can't remain at some noumenal level. It can't be the freedom to think what you want to think, or it can't be the freedom to believe what you want to believe. No. You need to be able to see the evidence of the freedom, because that is how you learn about things like cooperating with others and shaping your historical conditions. And so without that, without the land where freedom can be active, and again at a very high level of abstraction, then this is freedom that is merely psychological, merely psychic. It doesn't have that mediating link where you engage with the object and then you bring it back. And so I think that is at least the core of what he's thinking, that to not only be barred from the land but locked into the space, but he also kind of uses metaphor where the colonial forces actually think of the colonized as themselves simply land or manure or merely natural resources, is to be what is worked on with no ability to respond and shape yourself. And so without the land, I think that's just the condition of possibility for anything like an integrated form of collective agency.
Yeah. It's wrapped up with the dehumanization question too. There's a line from the Colonial War and Mental Disorders chapter that really hit. And again, thinking about like the resonance with what's going on in Palestine today, where he says, under the German occupation, the French remained human beings. Under the French occupation, the Germans remained human beings. In Algeria, there is not simply domination, but the decision literally to occupy nothing else but a territory, right? And there's like the settler colonial reverie is that of a depopulated space, which is always false, which is always not true.
A land without a people for a people without a land.
Exactly. And he already sees this here, right, as being kind of establishing the parameters or coordinates within which something like the birth of a new humanity is going to have to be possible. This is the crucible of it. I'm also can I just say this? I'm sick and fucking tired of living in prehistory. Can we please get out of prehistory? I'm losing my mind.
Bro, I feel like we've been waiting so
history
long.
Would be really nice right now.
I want just a little scrap of history, please. I'm tired of this. Yeah.
I mean, I guess this claim about what it means to be trapped like that. Have you all listened to Norman Finkelstein's like many podcast interviews since October?
Yeah,
A bunch.
A bunch.
Yeah.
Where he starts talking about what was going on before then, and he describes Gazans as a God-forsaken people. Like, I actually think that's where like he lost hope that anything would change. That he'll say, like, I confess that I too thought that this was over, that nothing was going to happen. And then he starts talking about God forsaken. His like way of saying that is actually that they had no past, no present, and no future. So like he creates this interesting moral equivalence between like the not having of a history and the God forsaken characterization of it. That has like, for some reason, I mean, I think for obvious reasons, it's like an impactful thing to say, but it actually has stuck with me quite a bit over the past months because it makes me think about Ilan Pappé's book about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the like description of the like Zionification of the land, the renaming of forests, the putting up of playgrounds, the just literally remaking of the map, not like letting it happen on accident, but just destroying a memory and refusing to let anybody who tried to go back and see it or try to see where their village had been and just brutalizing them if they even tried to slip into like a forest. There's, I think what has to be important about the harm being done is that there is a link, there is a political link between those things. The memory destruction, okay, and then the being trapped and being God forsaken and without a history. You know, like those seem to be like a very strong equivalence, you know, like the double helix between like the psychological and the political. And so when you say, why does the land matter? Why the right of return? Why does it matter to rectify this land specifically?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have to be this land specifically if you don't care about addressing that problem. Like, I mean, if it's some other kind of problem, it doesn't have to be this land. If it's, you know, but do you care about these people at this time and what was done to them and what they, and the answer to that question is then this land matters. And the only way you get to say otherwise is if you just think, you know, those, the memoricide of the Nakba, that's, I think, what Pappé calls it. It's just not a constitutive part of the problem, but the problem is for those people, both in reality and for the people concerned, it is.
And I also think you get to this concrete conclusion of why land matters, not because of, I realized, you know, I always imagine people listening to this and being the most ungenerous, you know, assholes imaginable. You're like, oh, so what's left of philosophy? They believe in mystical ties to land. Like, no, Lillian, what you were describing are these, you know, concrete structures and names and histories that, you know, allow a sense of belonging and the social integration of being a person. And so you can only think
there's a psychic importance of that land.
And that's how we develop and understand ourselves as part of a we. And so if you think that the answer is simply, well, why don't you just move? You know, so there are two things I think would be very clear. And what Fanon would say, you can only have that as your answer if you think that these are people who are simply without a history, without any wants, desires, that they are mere objects that you can just place somewhere else. Well, if you think that, then you don't fucking think they're human. Okay. And two, it's not about staying, but I think what Fanon would say, and maybe this brings it back to a little bit about his strategic relationship to the nation. I do think strategic because deeper in the book, you know, he sees some of the people becoming political leaders and he thinks that they're nightmares. He's really worried about the national bourgeoisie that emerges that's clearly going to cut off the movement.
And the nationalist parties.
Exactly. But he thinks you can only really feel yourself as having the ability to move and go other places once you have been able to say, oh, there's a place that I belong. And I see I am leaving because I desire to. I'm not leaving because I'm being ejected. And this goes back to the psychological stuff of being able to process the experience. Being ejected doesn't allow for the processing of the experience of saying, this is what I choose, what I want. And to think that you can, then it just actually says what you think about these people. You don't think of them as people. You don't think of them as part of history. You think of them as something that's completely different than what you take yourself to be, which is having an attachment to the things that you love, the language that you speak, the histories that you reflect yourself through.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, like, and it's only that grotesque level of dehumanization that enables, and this is, I think, something also important that like in Fanon's analysis of the effects on the French colonizers as well, like the way that they
to be clear, he thinks it fucks them up too.
Oh yeah, and you can see that when you look at these, like all these viral videos of like IDF soldiers, like fucking, like the glee with which they like engage, like in the genocidal destruction that they're doing. I mean, you can see that this is not like these people, not just those individual people, but the psychic damage being done to that like body politic, if you can even call it that, but that body politic is going to be like absolutely. I mean, it's already immense. You can't maintain an apartheid system without like intense psychological degradation on the part of the people that benefit from that apartheid system. But it's actually frightening to think about what the psychic results of this stage of that brutality are going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just think, like, on the land point, there's such another, just, I don't want to make it all about this like kind of resonance, but it's so hard to avoid that when Fanon talks about the justifications that the French give for like having a right to that land, it is exactly what the Israeli state says, basically, which is that, well, we made this land productive. Like this was a desert when we arrived here. Okay. And we're the ones that have like introduced, like through our technological brilliance and all this stuff. Like now we have a claim to it. Now put aside the ahistorical biblical claims, which are obviously stupid. But the more kind of, I think that for them, the more legitimate.
It's very John Locke coded.
Well, yeah, the more legitimating claim I think for them is that they made the olive grow, and they made they made the land yield.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted you all to read those files. I didn't want you all to just read the really tragic stuff, like the stuff with the kids. I mean, that just breaks your heart.
Fucking heartbreaking. Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the most harrowing things I've read in a really long time. Like, just to be clear, it's about these two kids that kill two Algerian kids that kill their European schoolmate, who they
describe as their best friend. Yeah,
but it was their friend, as their best friend. Yeah, but the idea that like the French wanted to kill all Algerians, which the French made pretty clear, like
word and indeed,
they internalized that.
Yeah, but I also wanted you all to read, again, imagine Fanon, a black guy sitting there in front of a French guard who's like, please make me well so I can torture and not bring this home. I wanted you all to read because you all know this.
How can I do my tortures without feeling so bad? But
imagine how fucked up you have to be at the place. And Fanon even says, like, he knows where the source of his anguish is from. It's the work that he does, and he's not willing to leave the work, which means you can't engage in a type of violence without it coming back. And so the idea that you can do something like this and it doesn't radically alter the psychic structure of those who do it, at least no form of psychology that's empirically testable bears that claim. It will shape the character, the practices, the habits, etc. So Fanon is basically looking at this and saying, this situation, it's killing the Algerians, but that's not humanity over there either.
Totally. Well, this is where again, like, I can't understand, like you said at some point in your introduction, something that I quite liked, which is just like, he's not just like a kind of like, I don't know, a positivist political theorist who's just like, well, revenge is justified. Like, that's not interesting, and that's not what he's saying. And I think that this is where he has to be understood as like a universalist, because the dehumanization that is like inflicted upon colonized people by the colonial oppressor is also their own dehumanization, right? There's not a way, like you said, it's not humanity on the other side of the wall either, right? It is in fact a situation of total dehumanization on both sides. And then of course the response to that can't be like, our turn to dehumanize now. That's not it, right? It's not a counter response like that in any way. It's a demand for actually putting an end to dehumanization, which means that of the oppressor as well. It has to be. Or again, then we are in something like, I don't know, an inevitable cycle of bloodshed or something like this. And he just does see that there is a possibility for something other than that to be taking place here. And it's not always borne out, and it's not always easy or obvious or like clear how it could be effectuated, but it's not just our turn. That's just not what he's talking about.
That's why I kind of like that language that I use. And it's my language. So if you want to disagree with me on this, I guess go ahead. But I do think there is a weird way that I have looking at the violence chapter, which is Fanon trying to say this is what the development of that principle of self-emancipation would look like. He didn't live long enough to see the end of the Algerian War. So some of what he's saying there, it had not yet come to pass. But he's trying to say that this is the logical arc of it. And the thing that I wanted to leave you all with, so it might seem, again, I don't know who's listening, we're talking about depersonalization, dehumanization, that seems so ethical. But you know what you can't do well if you're dehumanized or depersonalized? Build robust political institutions. What types of politics emerge, not just from dehumanizing others, but I'm thinking about what type of society and political institutions emerge when that becomes the foundation of what your nation is doing. Mm-hmm. Again, I look at Israel and it's like, those are not robust democratic institutions either. And so you can't even be a responsible political human being when inflicting.
But also, imagine living in a situation in which you are going to continue to affirm that you are going to live, that you are always and everywhere going to be under siege. Like the mentality, as far as I can tell in Israel, is that no one in the world has any idea of what kind of danger we are in, and like, I just think it sounds like, what a way to live, man. That doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound good for anybody. I'm just putting it out there. Like that kind of both paranoid narcissism in which that it has to go internal, because you can see the glee they take. And, I'm going to generalize just because I'm generalizing about the violence that I see, with my ever-loving eyes on the fucking internet. The glee that is being taken in the destruction of these people is the sickest thing I've ever seen in my entire fucking life. I've many times since October thought to myself, I know what it is like to watch a lynching now. You know those postcards that the people in the American South made? Like, come join the lynching and we're all going to laugh and chortle and act like we're having a great time. And we look at those and you're like,
how?
What?
How's that possible?
Now I know. We're watching it right now.
Yeah.
That has to get into your soul and create such extreme, neurotic, angry tension. I don't know how you could live like that. And I and people should realize, actually, you don't have to. You don't have to live like that. And I feel like that's the point here.
One of the symptoms of that is like how irrational and bizarre those officials sound like every time they go on the news. Yeah. Like they have been like completely psychically distorted by like the glee and that violence. Like it looks like it's fake, like it's an AI or something. It can't possibly, like, you have dehumanized yourself to such an extent that, like, I mean, there's already been lots of jokes about how none of these stupid things that they try to produce that are supposed to be funny are actually funny. Yeah. Like, oh, look, it's a blue-haired person on a college campus who loves Hamas or whatever. These are the most cringe things imaginable. But I actually think that's important because it's like, that is, and to go back to our other episode on Fanon, like, that is what the destruction of like reason, dignity, and humanity like looks like. Those are the spiritually degrading consequences of doing that. You can't be funny. Being funny requires some degree of reason.
I actually like that.
Yeah, I think picking up on like the last episode, like I was noticing maybe because of that episode, how much like I was noticing every time Fanon mentions reason, because I think there is an attempt to like dialectically recover enlightenment to some extent. He uses the word like he describes violence as enlightenment also at one point in the text, and he really, really kind of focuses on like on reason when he talks about the transformation that's taking place in the elimination of individualism, like the surpassing of individualism and the kinds of, I don't want to use the word deliberative spaces because colonialism doesn't allow for in itself deliberative
he says
space.
It's a machine.
But the colonize themselves, exactly. It's no response to reason, right? It's a machine incapable of thought, like colonialism. But then he describes what the neighborhood assemblies are like and what the kind of organizing the kind of experience of organizing. And he says that those communal experiences exude light, they exude reason, right? Like the kinds of organizing, and that's where you get to the importance of, like, if you only focus on violence, it's easy to miss the indications of what the creation of a new humanity looks like in that chapter.
Nice.
And what it looks like is in those moments where individualism they're able to actually surpass individualism, not as a matter of like a concept or a decision, but as a form of praxis in which there's a kind of collective reason, which underneath all of that terror and idiocy and lying and mendacity, there's a kind of there's a light of reason that is exuded from. I just thought.
And in those moments, he says, like, a new vocabulary spontaneously starts to emerge, right? A new lexicon, a new way of comrade, brother, solidarity, sister, a new articulation, right? In which something like a collective we, infused with like a reason and a light, becomes kind of aware of itself as, precisely not just a heap of individuals, but as something more significant, participating in a humanity that has universalist aspiration. I don't know. I think these moments are really beautiful.
Yeah. I was really struck by them.
I do want to follow up maybe one last comment on what you said about comedy. I think that's really right, that like comedy has to be rational. I hadn't thought about it that way, but in order to be genuinely funny, because it's a practice of autocritique and reflection. So that's why, political correctness in comedy, you don't need to worry about political correctness if it's funny.
Of course. No,
everyone serious knows this. Because there's a kernel of reason in it then.
I mean,
and by the way, I think like it doesn't matter if you're right wing or left wing in comedy. If it's funny, and everybody knows it's funny, and then there's no debate about it. And it's not true that people of different political persuasions can't be funny. The problem is that you have to find the there. And if it's funny, if people are laughing, it's because it's funny, and there's no additional, there's no add-ons required. If people aren't laughing, it's not funny. But I was just thinking that the thing that makes the humor, I was listening to that like famous interview Cat Williams did with Shannon Sharp, that incredible interview where he, because Cat Williams is really funny and he knows he's funny. It's extremely funny. And he's like, the thing is, it can't be condescending. He's like, when I'm making that black woman joke, I'm making it to my black woman friend. When I'm making that white man joke, I'm talking to my white man friend. And the reason it's funny is because it doesn't matter from what perspective you approach it from. It's going to be funny because there's rationality to it. You don't need to sit around and pick it apart. It's like, ha, he got me, or them, or whatever. That's it.
It even approaches the object as another person rather than a thing evacuated of all life and all of that. I think, my last concluding comment, I really like the ground that we covered in this episode. And I think I just want to, leave it at, for Fanon, you need to remember that the violence isn't the point. The violence is a symptom of a fucked up situation. The point is humanization. You could even call it socialization. If, the counterfactual it uses, if it were possible to achieve decolonization without a single bullet being fired and a new world being created, Fanon would, jump. He would be the first to jump.
First one there.
If it were possible to leap over the nation form,
because he's a care worker,
he would. Yeah. He would be there. Yeah, and I like that. Yeah, because he is a care worker. And that's why I want Joe to read the medicine stuff, because he is a philosopher, revolutionary, but he also is a doctor. He took that very, very seriously because he took liberation seriously.
He took humanity seriously.
That does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Taylor Hartwig, Wayne Anderson, Molly Abatista, Randall Nelson Peterman, Sebastian, Joy Lewis, DC, Luhan Gabel, Daniel Kulabiakin, Jack Whelan, Nicholas Sienna, Lucas Leibel, Lynn Huffer, Carmen de Schrijver, Joe, Isabel, Alberto, Aaron Bajkowski, David Lyon, Martin Weir. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes, bonus videos, and access to our Discord server. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store linked on our website. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Free Palestine.
Da Wondery, esse é o